Hi everyone, welcome to this room in my house. um, so, on Wednesdays, I would like to infuse a little color into our world, external to our work environments and our home environments. And in doing that, what I would like to do is bring information about books I'm reading, articles, music I'm listening to, TV, podcasts, whatever. And if you have suggestions, I'm taking them. I'm always taking suggestions for things I should be listening to, interacting with, etc. So this week, and I won't promise, let me stop. I won't promise to do it every Wednesday because I try not to make promises I'm not going to keep. But I'll do the best I can and try to get you as much consistency on this as possible. So this week, I'd like to talk about the podcast We Can Do Hard Things. This is a podcast that is weekly with Glennon Doyle and her wife, Abby Wambach, and often her sister. It's a good podcast. I've listened to it off and on. I will tell you, I am the worst podcast subscriber because I go weeks and weeks and weeks and don't listen, and then I'll listen to a couple or something will get my attention. This week, however, or no, last week, I think it was last week's podcast. I think this week she talked to someone else. Last week, Abby and Glennon talked to Andrea Gibson, the poet extraordinaire, and I was like, sign me up. It was especially touching. I listened to it 2 days ago, and I feel like it's pulsing in my veins still. It was especially touching because Andrea was sharing that she's had a relapse of the cancer diagnosis that she'd had, and that it's very likely terminal, and so she's now walking this journey towards the end of her life. And so she talked a lot about getting the diagnosis, her family dealing with it, she even talked about what she thinks happens when you die, and what her faith looks like at this stage. She grew up Baptist, she's queer, she kind of walked away from the Baptist part of her life, but what does Jesus mean to her? What is all of this? It's very multi-layered. There's funny moments and there's sweet moments. And I was very, very touched. And so I want to encourage you to listen to it. I think it's an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and 10 minutes. At the beginning, fairly early in the podcast, Andrea says that she often quotes herself to her friends. So she'll be like, a wise person once said, and then she quotes her own poetry to people. So one of the lines she quotes at the very beginning is, even when the truth isn't hopeful, I'm reading, by the way, even when the truth isn't hopeful, the telling of it is. And that sentence sums up this podcast. So what I would say is, listening to Andrea Gibson talk about her diagnosis is worth every word. It can be triggering. So if you're in the midst of grief, or if you have struggled recently or in the past with suicidal ideation, consider that it's heavy because she's talking about death and dying. But there's also so much hope and energy. She's vivacious. She's powerful. There's a lot going on there. And what strikes me, and I'm trying to get emotional saying this, is her voice breaks as she talks about the pain in her family at this news. Her voice breaks as she talks about her partner and the partner she's been through diagnosis, through recovery, through relapse, right? Her voice breaks talking about how her friends are trying not to say things to her that she's like, just say it, right? And so she talks about these things. And her voice is breaking the whole time while she talks about the joy of being human and humanity being so important to her from this place. And what's fascinating to me is that the crack in her voice is as mesmerizing as the power in her voice, right? Because she's a spoken word poet, right? And she has this power and that the sadness and grief that is with her. And it just really hit me deeply because we often have to operate in courage from a place of grief or fear or pain. And Andrea Gibson is the embodiment of that right now. And this podcast is a really beautiful representation of that. So I want to read you, at the end of the podcast, she reads one of her poems that's called Tincture. And it's gorgeous, and her reading it and her speaking it is so beautiful. But I want to read you the very, very end. So the idea here is that after we die, the soul misses the body, right? And misses what it was like to be in a physical body and the physical presence of the body. And so this is towards the end. She says, what else could hold on so tightly to everything? What else could hear the chain of a swing set and fall to its knees? What else could touch a screen door and taste lemonade? What else could come back from a war and not come back, but still try to live, still try to lullaby? When a human dies, the soul moves through the universe, trying to describe how a body trembles when it's lost, softens when it's safe, how a wound would heal given nothing but time. Do you understand? Nothing in space can imagine it. No comet, no nebula, no ray of light can fathom the landscape of awe, the heat of shame, the fingertips pulling the first gray hair and throwing it away. I can't imagine it, the stars say. Tell us again about goosebumps. Tell us again about pain. So, I highly recommend you go to wherever you get podcasts. Look up We Can Do Hard Things, and I believe it is podcast number 115. It's the one from last week. It's not this week, which has Ross Gay, also great, but it's the one from last week. Highly recommend it. Have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you down the road.